Hello, everybody. So, I was on vacation for the past 2 weeks, so I kind of got behind on some Loki episodes. So, today I'm going to play a bit of catch up and talk about episodes 3 through 5. Let's go. So first, I'm going to give my general thoughts on these 3 episodes, then I'm going to go into each specifically and kind of talk about the specifics that I want to talk about. There's going to be a lot more that I want to talk about in episode 4 than I do for 3 and 5, but I'll do that, and then I'll go into my predictions for where I think, what I think is going to happen in the finale, and what I think it's going to mean for the future of the MCU. But first, let's get into my general thoughts on these 3 episodes, and I think they were very good. I think they did a good job at telling the middle of the story. I say that because, obviously, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you kind of have to compare this to that, and, Falcon and Winter Soldier really didn't do a good job in the middle of doing that. I think they kind of had a good beginning, a good ending, and other people have said this also, but it didn't really have a good middle portion. And so I think that this did a good job at, setting everything up at the beginning, and then having these 3 episodes really be the middle and kind of revealing things that, having big reveals, big twists, kind of taking everything that we learned in the first 2 episodes and turning it on its head, revealing that we were lied to, that much of the stuff that we were told by the TVA isn't actually true. And each of these episodes tackled one thing, one thing the TVA said that was wrong. 3rd episode does one thing, 4th episode does another thing, 5th episode does another thing, and you just realize as it's going that, this is much different than we thought. So that's why I think these episodes work very well. They did the middle of the story perfectly and set up the finale to be epic. And I'm very excited to see what happens next. But with that said, let's get into episode 3. And there's not really much for me to talk about in episode 3. It definitely felt a bit filler-ish, but it was still a really fun episode. I think we got some good interactions between Loki and Sylvie. We obviously got the big reveal that everybody at the TVA are variants. And this episode really set up episode 4 well. You kind of needed this episode to happen to bridge the gap between episodes 2 and 4, and to allow episode 4 to be what it was, because if you've seen it, it's amazing. But again, this episode isn't bad by any means. I really had a good time with it. The main story of it is Loki and Sylvie are trying to escape a planet that's about to be destroyed, and they end up failing to do so by the end of it. I think that because that was the story, that kind of makes it fillerish, because it's this planet doesn't matter because it's going to be destroyed, and so it's just there's, we don't see Mobius, we don't see any of the TVA, and so that's kind of, it feels very different from the first 2 episodes, so I think that's why a lot of people say it was very fillerish, and I agree with that, to an extent, but it was fun filler. If you're gonna have filler in a show, I think this is how you should do it, and it was fun to see. We got some, information about the character of Loki and Sylvie, which I thought was cool to kind of slow everything down, because I think that's what makes these Disney Plus shows different than the movies, is you can have these slow moments where, you don't have to have every single moment be, used to the fullest. You can have slow moments to really look into the characters, rather than, whereas in, a movie, you couldn't have this time just have Loki and Sylvie having a conversation in the train to the Ark. Like, you can't have, that, like, that's like 10 minutes of the episode, I think. And, you can't have that in a movie. You can't have that much time be given to just this conversation. But in a show, you can do that. You can have it slowed down. You could have an entire episode where it's just Loki and Sylvie talking to each other, revealing things about each character, and I think that's cool. That's if this was a movie, of course, this whole episode probably been chopped down completely, and you really only get like a few. You get only a fraction of the amount of what happened in this episode. But because it's a show, you have the time to slow everything down. So I think that's kind of how I see this episode. I think that it does feel a bit filler-ish, but that's also kind of inherently what makes these shows different than the movies. So that's about all I have to say about the third episode. One last thing I'll say is that final long take shot where Loki and Sylvie are running through the city as it's getting destroyed, and they're fighting all of the soldiers there. That was cool. I like that long take. I thought that was epic. That was cool to see. So I very much enjoyed that. And of course, it ends with the Ark being destroyed, and Loki and Sylvie are still stranded on the planet about to be destroyed. Which then brings us to episode 4, where we start out. We see Sylvie on Asgard getting taken by the TVA, and we see her going through the same stages, the same levels that Loki had to go through, but whereas when Loki went through them, it was kind of played as a joke. Here, it's played as kind of the horrific thing that it is, the terrible thing that it is, because we've now learned that by this point that the TVA isn't what isn't what it seemed to be. And I think that was cool to kind of see, like, this new look, to kind of go back to, to this thing that we saw at the beginning of the show and have this new perspective on it. Whereas first we saw Loki, the villain who, just tried to take over New York, take over the world, just sent aliens to New York City. And then we see it through this new lens of just a child. A little girl got taken, playing with her toys, minding her own business, just all of a sudden gets taken and put through this, the different levels of entering the TVA, and it's interesting to see that from the new perspective. And so she ends up taking the tempad of, who's now the leader lady of the TVA. She was, at that point, just an agent, and she takes the tempad and escapes and goes on the run, for, till where we see her now. So then we have a conversation between Mobius and leader lady, and she tells him that the agent that was taken by Sylvie in episode 2, and the one we saw at the beginning of the third episode, where when Sylvie was, in her mind and giving her a memory from her old life, she tells him that she died. That when she was taken back to the TVA, she had a deep decline, she went crazy, and ended up dying. And she tells him not to tell anybody else this information. And Mobius is kind of not really believing it, but it was kind of getting a bit suspicious, but not really saying anything just yet. Then we go back to the planet, Lamentus 1, that's about to be destroyed. Loki and Sylvie are still stranded there, and we get this heartfelt moment between them, and this ends up creating a branch in the timeline in an apocalyptic event, which shouldn't be possible. Because what we learned in episode 2 is, you can go to an apocalyptic event, do whatever you want, no branch will be created, but this ends up creating a branch because, well, Loki is ending up falling in love with Sylvie, which means he's falling in love with another version of himself. So that's kind of weird, and that kind of breaks reality to have a person falling in love with another version of themselves. So that ends up creating a really steep branch, and the TVA comes, captures them, brings them back to the TVA. Mobius throws Loki into this time cell where he's in this time loop where Sif is there, which that was cool to see Sif again. And she's mad at him for cutting her hair, and she punches him, knees him in the groin, tells him he's going to be alone forever, and this is on a loop. He's in there for a little while for it to loop a couple of times. Then Mobius comes, takes him out of it. They have a conversation where at first they pretty much tell each other different lies back and forth until we eventually get to this point where Mobius makes Loki realize that he likes Sylvie, that he's in love with Sylvie, he's in love with another version of himself. That breaks reality, and that created the Nexus event on Lamentus 1. And then Loki reveals to Mobius that he's a variant, that everybody at the TVA are variants, that the Timekeepers didn't create them. They're all just variants that were taken from the Sacred Timeline. And Mobius, you could tell he's kind of like, yeah, this makes sense, but he doesn't want to believe that. And so he sends Loki back into the time cell, the time loop with Sif. And then we get another conversation between Mobius and the leader lady. They have a conversation about, she asks him where he would go on the timeline, if he could go anywhere, anytime, where would he go? And he kind of, dodges that question. He's kind of like, well, I like being here now, doing the job with you. And so she's like, all right, whatever. And Mobius is kind of starting to be suspicious of her, because, he doesn't really believe that C20 died. He is wondering why she's not letting him interview Sylvie, because he normally would, and he's like, what's going on here? So he ends up switching their temp pads, and he takes hers, ends up seeing this video of C20 telling everybody that, saying that she knows that everybody there are variants, that Sylvie put in her mind memories that she realized is from her life on the timeline, and so that's why she was killed. She didn't die because Sylvie mind controlled her. She died because she figured out the truth that everybody there are variants. So Mobius goes, gets Loki out of the time cell, tells him that he can be good. He doesn't have to play his part on the timeline that he always does. He doesn't have to be the bad guy. He can be good if he wants to be. And they go out of the cell, and Leader Lady and a bunch of TVA agents are there to confront them. So Mobius says he answers the question that Leader Lady asked him before. He says he wants to go on the timeline wherever he's from, wherever he has a jet ski. He wants to go back to his life, and then he gets pruned. And you're like, oh my god, Mobius just got pruned! What the heck is going on here? He was a great character, no! Well, we'll get back to that in a second, but then Leader Lady takes Loki and Sylvie to the Timekeepers to, I guess, get killed, and then Hunter B-15, actually, I have to talk about Hunter B-15, so she, in episode 2, Sylvie mind controlled her, and in order to mind control people at the TVA, she has to give them the memories from their past lives, and so she's now, like, what was that? So she takes Sylvie and she gets her to show her old life and realizes that she's a variant and turns on the TVA. So back to this point, Loki and Sylvie are in front of the timekeepers. Hunter B-15 comes in and saves them. We get this big battle with Loki and Sylvie against the TVA agents, and at the end of the battle, Sylvie throws a dagger at one of the timekeepers, cuts off their head, and falls to the ground. But they see there's all wires in there, and they realize the timekeepers are robots. And now they're wondering, who's actually behind the TVA? That's a question to be revealed later, but then Loki decides to confess his love to Sylvie. He starts to do that, but then, oh no, Loki gets pruned also. And you're like, oh my god, Loki just got pruned. How can they do that? He's the main character of the show. What is happening? The episode ends. But there's a mid-credit scene. So, Loki wakes up. He's in what looks like an apocalyptic New York. Looks like there's the Avengers Tower in the background. And he sees a bunch of other Loki variants. There's an old Loki, there's a kid Loki, there's African-American Loki holding what looks like a hammer, there's a crocodile Loki, and then it ends. You're like, what the heck was that about? Well, that brings us to episode 5, and kind of like episode 3, I don't have a ton to say about this episode. Definitely not as much as I did about episode 4, but we find out that Loki is in this place called the Void, which is basically the end of the timeline where there's this giant cloud monster that's destroying everything in its path and ensuring that, it kills any variant. And so all the Loki variants that are there, they're basically just trying to escape, trying to avoid the monster. I don't remember what it was called, but, the cloud monster, they're trying to evade that. And I think just one cool thing about this episode was seeing a bunch of different versions of Loki, how they're all similar, how they're all different. We get old Loki. He says that he survived Thanos by doing what that one fan theory said, where he creates a double of himself and hides as a piece of debris in the background, which is exactly what, there was a theory about that when Infinity War came out, that, people were like, oh my god, look, in the background, there's a piece of debris, kind of looks like Loki. And that's apparently what this old Loki did. Now, I don't know if that means that's what happened in Infinity War. Like, we still have our Loki from there that, lived through all of the MCU movies, that he did that also, and we're going to, at some point, find him on the, desolate planet that he went to at some point in the future. I kind of hope that it doesn't mean that, because I think that was a good death for Loki, and I think if we're going to continue to see a Loki in the MCU, I would want it to be the Loki from this show, and not, Infinity War Loki. So, I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know if they're gonna do that or not. Again, I hope that they don't, but we'll see what happens. But then, speaking of Lokis in the Void, Sylvie ends up pruning herself, going to the Void. She pretty much immediately gets, starts to get attacked by the Cloud Monster, but is saved by Mobius. He's alive! Yes! So, they meet up with Loki and the other Lokis, and they hatch a plan to enchant the Cloud Monster because they believe that it's guarding wherever the person who's really running the TVA is hiding. So then Mobius goes back to the TVA to take it down. Old Loki ends up epically sacrificing himself, and Loki and Sylvie enchant the Cloud Monster, revealing where the person who's really running the TVA is hiding, and walk towards it. The episode ends. There's no post-credit scene, which I found really surprising. I thought there was going to be, a mid-credit scene or a post-credit scene or something, but nope. We just get left hanging, and we're gonna have to wait for next week for the epic finale, which I'm very excited about. I think they set this up well. They set the finale up well, and I think it's going to be amazing. But now let's get into my predictions for what I think is going to happen in the finale and what I think it's going to mean for the rest of the MCU. The big question is, who's actually behind the TVA? My first guess is another Loki. I think that would make the most sense. I think that would be, that would work as a really, a good reveal, a good twist that makes sense with the show. I think, to have it be another Loki variant would fit with the show, so that's my first guess. If not, then maybe Kang the Conqueror. I know that's what a lot of people have been throwing around, so possibly Kang the Conqueror, or, of course, maybe Mephisto. He's the answer for everything, so, he kind of has to be in there somewhere, so either another Loki variant, Kang the Conqueror, or Mephisto. Then my other prediction kind of deals with what I think the fate of this Loki is going to be. I think he's either going to, defeat whoever the big villain who's running the TVA is, and he and Sylvie are going to go live happily ever after in their own timeline. Or Loki is going to die, and Sylvie is going to end up being a major character in the MCU, kind of continuing the Loki story. So I think those are the two options where I think, this character of Loki on the show is going to end up at the end of the show. He's either going to end up with Sylvie or dead. And Sylvie, if he dies, Sylvie will continue to be in the MCU as a major player. I definitely think Mobius is going to end up in his own timeline, riding a jet ski. I feel like that kind of has to happen. But whatever happens in the finale, I know that it's going to set up Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and maybe also Spider-Man No Way Home. But if not No Way Home, definitely Multiverse of Madness. So, so those are all my predictions for Loki, for the Loki finale, and I think that these three episodes 3, 4, and 5, were very good. Again, they did a good job with telling the middle of the story and setting up the finale to be great. But those are all my thoughts on everything. Please comment below your thoughts on episodes 3 through 5, and on the video, and what your predictions are for the Loki finale. What do you think is going to happen? Also, please remember to give this video a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and maybe check out some of my other videos. And with that said, that's a wrap.